In his farewell address to the nation in January of 1989, President Ronald Reagan returned to a familiar image, the city upon a hill envisioned by John Winthrop in his 1630 sermon, A Model of Christian Charity. Reagan saw America as that metaphorical city, a blessed place that Reagan said was, quote, teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace, end quote. Nearly 2 years before Reagan spoke those words, filmmakers Joel and Ethan Coen released their 1987 comedy, Raising Arizona, a film ostensibly about a couple, a recidivist married to a police officer, struggling to complete their family and, by extension, achieve an ideal of happiness and contentment. On its own, the film is among the best in the Coen canon, replete with the brothers' peculiar characterizations and esoteric dialogue that are hallmarks of their brand. Nicolas Cage and Holly Hunter make an oddly winning pair, and the supporting roles, particularly those of John Goodman and Frances McDormand, are expertly cast and performed. Although it received a tepid reception from filmgoers and critics alike upon its release, famed critic Pauline Kael wrote that it was, quote, no big deal, end quote, it has since achieved a kind of cult status, voted number 31 by the American Film Institute on its list of the 100 funniest movies of the 20th century. Beyond the surface charm of this Preston Sturges-like comedy, however, is a compelling allegory for 6 years of Reagan rule as the Coens see it to that point, and it is far removed from Winthrop's vision. When the veneer of prosperity and morality is peeled back, the America of the 1980s is revealed to be as shallow and illusionary as one of Reagan's old movie sets. Instead of a land teeming with people living in harmony and peace, the Coens present a country plagued by self-absorption, a growing chasm between rich and poor, and a ruling class that derives its wealth and power by exploiting the common man. Social mobility is a myth. Morality is a front for corruption and scandal. The real apocalypse, the Coens argue, is not a potential nuclear holocaust that destroys with a bang the ever-present Cold War fear, but a loss of compassion and the rise of the moral majority and a return to the Horatio Alger philosophy of success that relegates millions to the margins. Behind the slapstick, Raising Arizona posits that Reagan's city upon a hill is not a shining edifice standing on eternal rock at all, but a desert mirage. The Arizona setting for the film is central to the Coens' indictment of the Reagan Revolution and is symbolic on multiple levels. The title itself superficially represents the raising, i.e. rearing, of Nathan Arizona Jr., the infant that Cage, H.I. Hi McDonough, and Hunter, Edwina Ed McDonough, kidnapped from the home of a local and prominent furniture dealer because they are unable to conceive a child of their own. On a deeper level, it represents the raising up of that mirage. The city is not a city near an ocean, but the very antithesis of that image, just as the couple's trailer in the middle of an empty desert is the antithesis of High's description of it, a starter home in a Tempe suburb. Deeper still, Raising Arizona means both raising up the dead philosophy of Barry Goldwater, the father of the modern conservative political movement in America and 5-time U.S. Senator from Arizona, and the career of Ronald Reagan, the actor-turned-politician who famously spoke on Goldwater's behalf in his A Time for Choosing speech in the closing days of the 1964 presidential election. Reagan's speech a week before Election Day came on a television program prophetically called Rendezvous with Destiny, and while it turned Reagan into a serious political figure, it did nothing for Goldwater, who was defeated in a landslide by Lyndon Johnson. Goldwater never figured prominently on the national stage again. His philosophy, however, created, quote, the breeding ground for the election of Ronald Reagan, end quote, as Goldwater's successor in the Senate and future presidential election loser, John McCain, put it. And when Reagan, who failed miserably to gain traction nationally in 1968, 1972, and 1976, finally defeated Jimmy Carter in a landslide of his own in 1980, it was as if both Goldwater in spirit and Reagan in body rose from the ashes of their own political bonfires like the aptly named Phoenix. In Raising Arizona, Hi McDonough is the father who, despite his best efforts, cannot succeed, while he dreams that the son he is raising will go on to achieve greatness. They are stand-ins for the defeated political father and his ideological son. Indeed, when Hi has his first parole hearing in the film, he and the parole board are on opposite sides of a table in the frame's margins. In the center, hanging from the back wall and larger than any character's head, is a framed picture of Barry Goldwater. As the film opens, High finds himself a victim of the policies that Goldwater championed and that Reagan implemented. With the shrinking of the welfare state and the easing of taxation for the wealthy, even as the middle and lower classes face higher taxation, he finds it impossible to make an honest living. As it states in his parole documents, he has, quote, no marketable skills except drilling holes in sheet metal, end quote. Absent a union to protect him in the wake of Reagan's war on organized labor, High comes to a familiar realization among blue-collar workers by the middle of the decade. Manual laborers, even if they can find work in a vanishing production market, are likely doomed to a lower-class existence with little hope for social mobility, a retirement fund, or college tuition for their children. Upon receiving his first paycheck, High looks incredulously at the amount as the company cashier intones, "The government do take a bite, don't she?" It's a sardonic nod to the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which lowered the top tax rate by almost half, from 50 to 28%, and raised the bottom rate by more than a third, from 11 to 15%. The result is predictable. High repeatedly turns to crime. But this, too, is a problem in Reagan's America. With a tough-on-crime crackdown and mandatory sentencing, High becomes the victim of a vicious cycle. He is doomed to a life of recidivism, and in the film's pre-credit exposition sequence, spends his time out of prison committing robberies that put him back inside. Fittingly, his convenience store chain of choice is the shortstop, a wink by the Coens indicating that High's time in civilized society is brief indeed. In their most overt attack, the filmmakers have High explicitly state in voiceover narration as he prepares to enter a store in order to rob it, that he, quote, tried to stand up and fly straight, but it wasn't easy with that sumbitch Reagan in the White House, end quote. Each time he returns to prison, he falls more deeply in love with Ed, who is charged with taking his mugshots. 6 times in the opening sequence, one for each year of Reagan's presidency to that point, she instructs him to turn to the right for a profile picture. It is, of course, a commentary on the country's ever-sharper turns to the political right and its iniquitous policies. High says at one point that, quote, absence makes the heart grow fonder, end quote. Although he certainly is referring to his feelings for and separations from Ed, he also is talking about life in prison, where each time he returns, quote, familiar sounds and faces almost made it like a homecoming, end quote. Life behind bars, despite its restrictions, also is secure. He has a roof over his head, a bed, and 3 meals a day. High and Ed do eventually marry. He proposes immediately after one of his many paroles, as she snaps mugshots of an acquaintance. But despite having dual incomes, they need money from her parents to buy the trailer. A sheet metal worker and a police officer together cannot move into the middle class, and when Ed is told by doctors that she's barren, they can't afford fertility treatments, and High's criminal past keeps them from adoption. The only option, again, is more crime, a kidnapping. The act may be criminal, but it is not malicious. Wealthy furniture dealer Nathan Arizona has, in the couple's eyes, more than he can handle. It is a cliched but thematically appropriate instance of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Nathan Arizona, in fact, has children solely because he is rich. Like Ed, Mrs. Arizona is barren, but this couple has the means to pay for fertility treatment. The result is the Arizona Quints, 5 instantly famous babies born to a couple who don't particularly seem to want them. When High climbs a ladder and enters the baby's bedroom window, the parents are downstairs in the living room of their McMansion, where they remain throughout most of a zany abduction sequence. Mrs. Arizona is reading Benjamin Spock's best-selling book on how to raise children, while Nathan reads the evening paper next to his Scotch cart and attends to business on the telephone. It is a snapshot developed from a time capsule, a perverse picture of June and Ward Cleaver living a quiet suburban life of American prosperity. High, who picks up and tests each of the babies, interestingly he decides against one named Barry, finally settles on Nathan Jr., after nearly being caught the one time the baby's mother absently checks on them. Ed briefly experiences the pangs of a guilty conscience, but High assuages her guilt by saying the mother has 4 more almost as good as this one. In brilliantly comedic fashion, the Coens paint a picture of America at that moment, The rich who get exponentially richer while the poor struggle, and in the case of High and Ed, literally risk everything to obtain a fraction of what the haves have. A gap sure to become a sociological crevasse, separating the relatively few on one side and the vast majority on the other. After barely a minute with her new baby, Ed sobs uncontrollably and cries that she just loves him so much. This reaction stands in stark contrast to Nathan, Arizona, whose only show of emotion is frustration over the local police and the FBI making a mess of his home, putting their feet on his coffee table, and handling his $500 camel's hair coat instead of tracking down, quote, Nathan Jr. or whichever the hell one of them they took, end quote. His only smile comes from the news cameras as he tells them, and everyone watching, that it's still business as usual at Unpainted Arizona, his chain of stores that sell cheap, unpainted furniture to the masses who can't afford anything better. The message, of course, is that even in the face of crisis, business is king, and the economic engine must keep running. Nathan, Arizona is the model for the conservative success story. He is the Horatio Alger myth come to life on the screen. Here is a man who changes his name, reinventing himself in the Jay Gatsby vein, and through the sheer force of personality, the rugged individual, creates a business and through hard work, even when dealing with a kidnapped child, achieves the American dream. Nathan, Arizona, as a symbol of Reagan's America, simultaneously represents the obliteration of any idealistic residue of the 1960s and the birth of the greed and commercialism of the 1980s that propped up a new, more cynical and crass culture that sought a return to traditional values but did little more than pay lip service to them, and all too often betrayed any real sense of morality with blatant hypocrisy. Nathan, Arizona is a man with more than he can handle, but it doesn't stop him from wanting more. Does he have disgruntled employees? They're all disgruntled because he isn't, quote, running a daisy farm, end quote. It would not be out of character for him to say, as Reagan did to ABC News in 1988, that homeless people, quote, make it their own choice for staying out there, end quote. The privileged are convinced that affluence is ordinary, while poverty is extraordinary. It's a world turned upside down. The Coens constantly play with this idea of perception, challenging key conservative talking points such as traditional values and morality. Reagan's rise dovetailed with that of Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority, founded in 1979 and disbanded 10 years later when Reagan left office. Members of the organization and conservatives at large felt that America had lost its way and the struggles of the 1970s were the result of immorality, failings that could be overcome if values were joined with politics. The result was sanctimony eventually exposed as hypocrisy. Raising Arizona was made and released during the spectacular fall from grace of televangelist Jim Bakker, who was closely associated with Falwell. Bakker, the Assemblies of God minister and host of the popular television program The Praise the Lord Club, was forced to resign after his affair with a church secretary became public. Bakker later served more than 5 years in prison for mail fraud and conspiracy, crimes associated with the running of his ministry. The Coens used the example of Glenn, High's boss, and Dot, and even Nathan, Arizona, to illustrate this type of hypocrisy. When the couple comes to the desert for a barbecue, Dot McDormand gushes over Nathan Jr., repeatedly calling him an angel who has been sent straight from heaven. She suggests the name Jason because she loves biblical names. Glenn later refers to one of their many children as Mordecai. Dot urges Ed to have the baby immunized and tells High to immediately begin saving for his eventual orthodonture and college tuition. She is portrayed as devout, motherly, and socially responsible. It is quickly revealed, however, that Dot, despite having a brood of children under the age of 10, wants another because the rest, in Glenn's words, are no longer cuddly. They, too, are looking to adopt because Glenn says, something's wrong with my semen. Glenn shows that he's racist, or at best culturally insensitive and ignorant, by complaining that the waiting list is, quote, 5 years for a healthy white baby, end quote. As he relates his troubles, Glenn intersperses 2 awkwardly told Polish jokes. Dot and Glenn, in addition to being neglectful parents and latent racists, are revealed to be swingers when Glenn proposes that the four engage in wife swapping. They are hypocrites on every level. This is shown too with Nathan Arizona, who angrily tells law enforcement that his child was in pajamas because, quote, nobody sleeps naked in this house, end quote, implying that is somehow sinful and wrong. Yet he has no problem treating his employees poorly or even going outside the bounds of the law by contracting with an anarchistic bounty hunter whom he thinks an evil man to find his missing child. Through their characters, the Coens are saying that in Reagan's America, it is one thing to speak and an altogether different thing to act. Cutting social programs, ignoring the AIDS epidemic, and dismissing the homeless is not a return to traditional Christian values. Business at any cost, particularly at the expense of low-wage workers, is not morality. At its heart, then, Raising Arizona advances the thesis that real values and morality cover all people. Nobody is left behind, and a government is at once fair, yet also calibrated toward helping the less fortunate, the people who need the most assistance. On this note, the Coens infused their film with themes and images of the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt pushed through his New Deal to counter the effects of the Great Depression. It is a direct assault on Reagan, the one-time FDR supporter and New Deal acolyte who somehow drifted from the Democratic Party and his position as head of the Screen Actors Guild to the Republican Party and his position as union-busting New Deal adversary, promoting a pull-yourself-up-by-the-bootstraps philosophy of a bygone age. By using the screwball comedy style made famous by Sturgis in the 30s and invoking the cartoon image of Woody Woodpecker and other stylistic touches of the time, the Coens are saying that what America needs in the 1980s is not Ronald Reagan, but his antithesis, another FDR. The vessel for this message is the duo of Gail Goodman and Evel William Forsythe, two associates of High's who escape from prison and come to his trailer for shelter just as Nathan Jr. is brought home. Gail and Evel are at the center of the film's broad second-half comedy, and it is Gail, sympathizing with High's financial troubles, who tells him, quote, "I'd rather light a candle than curse your darkness," end quote. It is an interesting and very deliberate choice of phrase. It was Adlai Stevenson, speaking at Eleanor Roosevelt's funeral, who commented that, quote, "She would rather light candles than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world," end quote. Stevenson did not invent the phrase. It is a Chinese proverb that speaks of a willingness to address a problem instead of merely complaining and doing nothing, or relying on do-nothing concepts such as trickle-down economics, a derisive term that originates with Will Rogers, who sarcastically noted that the Depression resulted when money was given to the wealthy in the hope that it would trickle down to the needy. It is Gail, who was fond of using pomade, a product at its most popular in the 1930s, who offers a solution to their financial woes, robbing a farmer's bank on the day that the locals cash their farm subsidy checks. Hyde declines, but when Gail and Evel attempt to rob the bank, it is filled with characters who look and dress as if they have come straight from auditioning for John Ford's The Grapes of Wrath. Even the source of funds is carefully chosen. Farm subsidies were a critical aid to small farmers facing devastating times in the Depression, while they were a source of great controversy in the 80s because most farms then and now are corporately run. If life is a game and the game is fixed in favor of the player with all the money and power, the vulnerable players don't stand a chance. In this way, the Coens' decision to connect High and the surreal bounty hunter who chases him with matching tattoos of Woody Woodpecker brilliantly juxtaposes FDR's legacy and Reagan's America. The bird in the cartoons, who made his debut in 1940 after New Deal programs became valued protections as America moved out of depression and into prosperity, is a symbol of resourcefulness and determination. In Reagan's America, High is the woodpecker, and Cage even sports spiked hair as plumage and is defined by a hawkish nose, is pummeled repeatedly by a system lacking compassion and understanding, and he must create his own opportunity. In the film's third act, he is terrorized by the Coens' most interesting creation, the lone biker of the apocalypse. The biker, Randall Tex Cobb, hired by Nathan Arizona, comes to High in a dream. High says in voiceover that he, quote, drifted off thinking about happiness, birth, and new life, end quote. But these thoughts are interrupted by something horrible. A man who laid waste to everything in his path and who, quote, was especially hard on the little things, the helpless, and the gentle creatures, end quote. This terrifying figure, quote, left a scorched earth in his wake, befouling even the sweet desert breezes, end quote. The biker is Ronald Reagan, and yet something more, something bigger. A mix of ideas and policies of Goldwater and Falwell and Reagan come together to tear down what came before. The American people went to sleep in November of 1980 and thought about happiness, birth, and new life, and 6 years later woke up to find a figure traveling the land leaving scorched earth in his wake, with the poor and the helpless and the vulnerable left scattered along the edges. The lone biker of the apocalypse does not spring to life from the void. He is the product of High's own mind. This in turn speaks to a larger act of creation. The biker exists because High literally wills him to exist. Indeed, near the end of his dream, High confesses that he fears, quote, "I myself had unleashed him," end quote, and predicts that, quote, "he was the fury that would be," end quote. In their own style of magical realism, the Coens released the biker into the film through the force of High's imagination. High's creation, after his meeting with Nathan, Arizona, embarks on a mission to find his creator. It is a brilliant metaphor for Ronald Reagan, who would not exist as a political figure except through the imagination of the American people, who dreamed of a solution to the country's woes and unleashed the fury that would be. It is here that the Coens engage in an interesting meditation on the concept of apocalypse. Throughout the Cold War, the world lived in fear of nuclear Armageddon. Goldwater's campaign was undermined in part by Lyndon Johnson's infamous Daisy advertisement, which implied that Goldwater, with his aggressive foreign policy, would provoke nuclear war if elected. That same year, filmmaker Stanley Kubrick made Dr. Strangelove, his satire on nuclear warfare and the end of the world. In that film, Peter Sellers attempts to decipher the recall codes for the bombers, settling on the letter combinations OPE and POE. Both of those initialisms appear on the back of a door in a gas station restroom in Racine, Arizona. At one point in the film, the biker crashes into the door on his motorcycle, knocking it over. He and the motorcycle then stand atop it, towering over it. The message is clear. The country did not have to fear a potential nuclear Armageddon from Goldwater or his equally aggressive protege, Reagan, nearly as much as they did the very real policies of the man being swept into office by the force of their will. Hyde defeats the biker in the end, but cannot win. He and Ed return the baby to Nathan, Arizona, who advises them to stay together and, quote, "hope that medical science catches up with you," end quote. Of course, it already has. They just don't have the means to utilize it. Raising Arizona ends appropriately with a dream of the future and of the desert. High is floating, lighter than air, and eventually, after watching Nathan Jr. grow up from afar, he sees himself and Ed as an old couple, with their own children and the children of those children. As High says, quote, "the old couple wasn't screwed up, and neither were their kids or grandkids," end quote. Everybody is happy, and the dinner table is filled with a bountiful harvest. High asks, quote, "was it wishful thinking? Was I just fleeing reality like I know I'm liable to do?" End quote. The answer seems to be yes. The kids and grandkids are dressed in clothes more appropriate to the 1950s, that dream world so many Americans point to as a time of happiness and prosperity, without ever remembering the details that might suggest otherwise. High says that it seems real, and this is the most important observation of all. For Reagan's America is a dream that might seem real and seem to be that shining city upon a hill, but only when all the other details are forgotten or brushed away. In dreams, then as now, America will be that city only when people in the margins are not left behind, and when compassion is a policy, not a concept, and when the weakest are afforded as much respect as the strongest. Sometimes it takes a comedy to see the tragedy, and to note that the oasis is a mirage doomed to evaporate into nothingness unless a people can will it into permanence.